Close your eyes and step into a city that no longer exists. I think most people have no idea how terrifying old London truly was. Imagine a London so different, it would terrify a modern traveler. This is not the sleek capital you know from postcards and movies. This is London in the 1600s, a city of fire, plague, and ambition. Honestly, I believe this era shaped the modern world more than any other. Over 200,000 souls were crammed inside these ancient walls. The streets were so narrow that neighbors could shake hands from upper windows. Think about that for a second. Your entire life in a space this claustrophobic. Timber-framed houses leaned over the lanes like drunken giants whispering secrets. The air tasted of coal smoke, river mud, and the sharp tang of human waste. There was no underground railway, no electric light, only the flicker of tallow candles. I find it incredible that people built an entire civilization in near total darkness. The Thames was not a quiet postcard river. It was a roaring highway of commerce. Hundreds of wooden boats jostled for space between merchant ships and royal barges. Watermen shouted for fares like taxi drivers in a city with almost no bridges. If you ask me, the Thames was the real heart of London, not any palace. London Bridge was the only crossing, and it was a city unto itself. Houses, shops, and even a chapel were built directly on top of the bridge. The heads of executed traitors rotted on spikes above the southern gatehouse. Imagine walking beneath those blackened skulls as you entered the city for the first time. I cannot think of a more brutal welcome sign in all of human history. The smell would hit you before you even crossed the threshold of the gate. Cheapside was the beating commercial heart of this cramped, chaotic world. Market stalls overflowed with silks from China, spices from the East Indies. Goldsmiths hammered precious metal into rings that gleamed under gray English skies. The noise was a relentless wall of shouting vendors and rattling cartwheels. What fascinates me most is how beauty and filth existed on the same street. But beneath the commerce lay a city rotting from the inside out. Open sewers ran down the center of every street like dark, sluggish veins. The river itself was a dumping ground for butchers, tanners, and every household. Rats moved through the walls of every home like a second, silent population. No one knew that these creatures carried the seeds of absolute devastation. I believe this is the most chilling example of invisible danger in all of history. In 1665, the Great Plague arrived like a whisper in the spring air. It began in the parish of St. Giles, among the poorest and most crowded houses. A red cross was painted on the door of every infected household. The words, "Lord have mercy upon us," were scrawled beneath in desperate chalk. Just picture a street full of red crosses, and you understand true collective terror. Watchmen stood guard to ensure no soul escaped from those marked doors. By summer, 7,000 Londoners were dying every single week. That number still shocks me every time I think about it carefully. Death carts rolled through the streets at night, collecting bodies by torchlight. The drivers rang bells and cried, "Bring out your dead into the empty darkness." Plague pits were dug in fields outside the walls to swallow the nameless victims. The wealthy fled to the countryside in gilded carriages, leaving the poor to die. I think this tells you everything about who really pays the price of disaster. London became a ghost city where only the desperate and the dying remained. The stench of death hung over the rooftops like a permanent, suffocating fog. 100,000 people perished before the plague finally loosened its grip. But London had barely caught its breath when a new horror arrived. In my opinion, what happened next is the most dramatic event in English history. On September 2nd, 1666, a small fire started on Pudding Lane. Thomas Farriner, a baker to the king, forgot to tend his oven that night. One man's carelessness destroyed an entire medieval city. Let that sink in. The flames caught the dry timber walls and leapt to the neighboring buildings. A fierce east wind turned a kitchen accident into an unstoppable inferno. The fire roared through the narrow wooden streets like a living, breathing beast. Londoners could feel the heat on their faces from a quarter of a mile away. I wonder how many stood frozen, unable to believe their entire world was burning. The sound of cracking timber and collapsing roofs echoed across the river. Molten lead poured from the roof of old St. Paul's Cathedral like silver rain. The great church, which had stood for 6 centuries, was consumed in a single night. For 4 terrible days, the fire devoured everything in its path without mercy. 13,000 houses, 87 churches, and the entire medieval city were gone. These numbers are staggering, but they cannot capture the human grief behind them. 100,000 people were left homeless, sleeping in open fields and tents. The sky above London glowed orange for days, visible from 40 miles away. Yet from this utter devastation came the greatest act of urban renewal in history. I genuinely believe the Great Fire was the painful birth of modern London. King Charles ordered that the new city be built in brick and stone, never timber. Sir Christopher Wren was given the task of rebuilding the soul of London. His masterpiece, the new St. Paul's Cathedral, took 35 years to complete. Its great dome rose above the city like a promise of resurrection and hope. The fire had killed the medieval city, but it gave birth to the modern one. But let us step back before the fire, to the London of William Shakespeare. The Globe Theatre stood on the south bank of the Thames in rowdy Southwark. 20,000 Londoners attended the playhouses every single week. Groundlings paid just 1 penny to stand in the open yard below the stage. They ate hazelnuts, drank ale, and heckled the actors with cheerful abandon. I love that theater was never a polite affair. It was wild and democratic. The smell of the crowd was a potent mix of sweat, beer, and Thames mud. Shakespeare himself walked these streets, drawing inspiration from every dark corner. His plays captured the violence, the romance, and the raw ambition of the age. I think Shakespeare understood London better than any historian ever could. The Tower of London loomed over the eastern edge of the city like a stone fist. It was a palace, a prison, a mint, and a menagerie, all within the same walls. Lions and leopards paced in cages near the entrance for visitors to gawk at. Prisoners scratched desperate messages into the cold, damp stone of their cells. The executioner's block on Tower Hill was stained with the blood of queens and knights. This was a city where glory and horror lived side by side without apology. In my view, the Tower represents everything about power: its beauty and its cruelty. The Palace of Whitehall was the largest palace in all of Europe at its peak. Over 1,500 rooms sprawled along the riverbank in a maze of courtyards. King Charles I walked from this palace to his own execution in January. He wore 2 shirts so the crowd would not see him shiver and think him afraid. That single act of defiance is, to me, one of the bravest moments in history. Westminster Abbey stood as the spiritual anchor of the entire English nation. Every king and queen had been crowned beneath its soaring Gothic arches. The cold stone floor held the bones of monarchs, poets, and warriors alike. But the real London was not in the palaces. It was in the streets below. I always say, if you want to know a city, look at its poorest streets first. Apprentices fought in taverns with fists and broken bottles after dark. Women sold oysters from baskets at a penny, a dozen on every corner. Children worked alongside their parents in workshops from the age of 7. The sound of church bells marked every hour of the day and every death in the parish. In the coldest winters, the Thames itself froze solid from bank to bank. Frost fairs erupted on the ice with tent stalls, puppet shows, and roasted ox. People danced on the frozen river as if the world had turned itself upside down. I find the frost fairs to be the most joyful and surreal image of this era. The ice groaned beneath their feet, a deep, unsettling sound like a living creature. London in the 1600s was a city in constant conversation with death. Yet it was also a city drunk on life, ambition, and the promise of tomorrow. Every cobblestone held a story of survival against impossible odds. The fog rolled in from the river every evening, swallowing the city in gray silk. Candles flickered in 1,000 windows like tiny, defiant stars against the dark. What I admire most about this London is its refusal to give up on itself. This was the London that burned, that suffered, and that rose again from the ashes. The blueprint of the modern city was drawn in fire, plague, and human stubbornness. Look at the streets of London today and see the ghost of 1666. The dome of St. Paul's still watches over the city like a silent guardian. The Thames still flows beneath the bridges, carrying the echoes of the watermen. The spirit of Shakespeare still breathes in every theatre on the South Bank. London did not just survive the 1600s, it was forged by them. I believe every disaster made the city stronger, sharper, and more determined to endure. The fog may have lifted, but the echoes of that dark century remain. Close your eyes and listen to the bells, the carts, and the river below. You are standing in the London that built the modern world from its own ruins. If this story teaches us anything, it is that cities are as tough as their people. The 1600s were not just history. They were the fire that made us. London 1600, the city that refused to die.